crushed behind the magic. Deborah Gale Stone was 18 years old when she started her dream job as a hostess at Disneyland's America Sings attraction in 1974. The ride was a rotating theater showcasing the history of American music through animatronic characters. Guests sat in a moving outer ring that rotates to different scenes, while the inner section was stationary. Between each scene, large walls would move, creating temporary darkness as the next set appeared. On July 8th, just 2 weeks after the attraction opened, Deborah was stationed between the stationary wall and one of the rotating platforms. Her job was simple: guide guests and ensure the show ran smoothly. What wasn't simple was the engineering flaw that would turn deadly. The gap between the moving and stationary walls was just 12 inches at its narrowest point, a space that left no margin for error. At approximately 10:30 p.m., as one scene transitioned to the next, something went wrong. Deborah became caught in the narrow space as the massive wall began its rotation. Security cameras didn't cover this backstage area. There was no emergency stop button within her reach. The hydraulic system powering the rotation exerted thousands of pounds of pressure, designed to move regardless of minor obstructions. Guests in the theater heard screams coming from behind the walls. Many assumed it was part of the show's sound effects. The walls continued their mechanical movement, crushing Deborah between them with inexorable force. The compression was catastrophic. Her ribcage collapsed first, puncturing her lungs and heart. Within seconds, the pressure fractured her spine and pelvis. By the time other cast members realized something was wrong and stopped the ride, it was too late. When maintenance workers finally separated the walls, they found Deborah's body grotesquely flattened, blood pooling on the floor beneath her. Medical examiners later determined she remained conscious for nearly 40 seconds, as her body was slowly crushed, experiencing excruciating pain before death finally came. The next day, America Sings reopened with new safety lights and proximity sensors. Deborah's death became a grim reminder of the machinery behind Disney's magic. The Derailment Disaster. Marcelo Torres was 22 years old when he visited Disneyland with friends on September 5, 2003. The California native chose to ride Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, one of the park's signature attractions. The Gold Rush-themed coaster was designed to simulate a runaway mine train. Reaching speeds of 30 miles per hour as it twisted through artificial caverns and desert landscapes. Torres settled into the front row of the first passenger car, directly behind the locomotive. What Torres couldn't know was that maintenance crews had been performing improper repairs on the ride for months. The previous night, mechanics had replaced a critical wheel assembly, but failed to install a required safety wire that would keep the axle in place. No supervisor had checked the work. As the train climbed the third lift hill, the unwired axle began to work loose from its housing. At 11:22 a.m., as the train crested the hill and began its descent, the front locomotive's undercarriage violently separated from its chassis. Metal screeched against metal as the cars behind it, still moving at full speed, slammed into the derailed engine. The first passenger car, where Torres sat, bore the brunt of the impact. The locomotive's weight crushed inward, compressing the space where Torres was seated. The collision fractured Torres's chest and ribs with such force that bone fragments punctured his heart and lungs. He remained conscious as blood filled his chest cavity, each breath becoming more difficult than the last. Medical examiners later found that Torres did not die instantly, but suffocated over approximately 2 minutes as his lungs collapsed. Nearby passengers, many with broken bones and facial lacerations, watched helplessly as he struggled to breathe. When paramedics finally reached the scene, they found Torres still strapped in his seat, his body contorted by the crushed compartment. Blood had soaked through his clothing and pooled on the ride's track below. His friends, seated just behind him, had suffered only minor injuries, a difference of mere inches between life and death. The Boy Who Fell from the Mountain. Mark Maples was 15 years old when he visited Disneyland with his family on January 3, 1964. The Matterhorn bobsleds had been operating for nearly 6 years by then, thrilling guests with its 80-foot drops and sharp turns that simulated an alpine adventure. The steel-tracked ride, themed after Switzerland's iconic mountain, was the first tubular steel roller coaster in the world. Mark and his friend boarded a bobsled car in the afternoon, securing the simple lap belt that was the ride's only restraint system. As the bobsled climbed the initial lift hill, Mark was visibly excited. Other passengers in nearby sleds later reported that he had been daring his friend to raise their hands during the drops. The cars reached the top of the first hill, preparing for the signature plunge that made the ride famous. What happened next occurred in just seconds. At the crest of the hill, as the bobsled began to pick up speed, Mark suddenly stood up. Whether it was a moment of teenage bravado or a misunderstanding about the ride's mechanics remains unknown. The physics were unforgiving. As the sled pitched downward at 20 miles per hour, Mark lost his balance. His center of gravity shifted forward and the momentum pulled him completely out of the vehicle. Mark fell approximately 30 feet before striking the steel track below. Primary impact was to his skull, causing an immediate depressed cranial fracture. Bone fragments were driven deep into his frontal lobe. Though the brain damage was catastrophic, death was not instantaneous. Medical examiners later determined that Mark remained alive for at least 2 minutes after impact, his breathing shallow and irregular as his brain began to swell inside his shattered skull. Ride operators found him splayed across the track, still conscious but unable to move or speak. Blood pooled beneath his head, running down the manufactured mountainside in thin rivulets. By the time the park's medical team arrived, Mark had slipped into a deep coma. He was transported to a nearby hospital where, despite emergency surgery to relieve the pressure on his brain, he died 3 days later without ever regaining consciousness. Decapitated on the slopes, Dolly Regine Young was 48 years old when she visited Disneyland in January 1984. The Matterhorn bobsleds had been one of the park's signature attractions for decades, and Dolly was eager to experience the Alpine-themed coaster again. The ride featured toboggan-style vehicles that raced through an artificial mountain at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour. Each 3-person bobsled was equipped with seatbelts, but ride operators didn't always verify they were fastened. On January 3rd, Dolly boarded a bobsled in the early afternoon. Whether she forgot to secure her seatbelt or it was improperly latched remains unclear. The ride began normally as her sled climbed the initial chain lift to the top of the mountain. At first, everything seemed fine. Then, as the vehicle navigated a sharp turn halfway through the ride, disaster struck. The bobsled hit a particularly rough section of track known for its jarring bumps. Dolly, without the security of a fastened seatbelt, was jolted upward. The momentum of the speeding vehicle combined with the centrifugal force of the turn was enough to lift her completely out of her seat. In an instant, she was thrown from the bobsled onto the cold metal track, her body splayed across the rails. For approximately 4 seconds, Dolly lay on the track, possibly conscious and aware of her predicament. Then came the sound of the next bobsled, already descending the mountain just 20 seconds behind hers. The oncoming vehicle had no time to stop. Its steel undercarriage struck Dolly's upper body with tremendous force. The impact severed her neck almost completely, leaving her head attached by only a few tendons and blood vessels. Blood sprayed across the white artificial snow, creating a ghastly contrast that would later haunt the ride operators who discovered her. The bobsled that struck her derailed partially, stranding its passengers above the grisly scene. Those riders reported hearing a sickening sound, part thud, part crack, as their vehicle hit what they initially thought was a piece of the ride's scenery. When emergency responders arrived, they found Dolly's body wedged beneath the derailed bobsled, her head twisted at an impossible angle. The coroner later determined that death was mercifully quick, resulting from immediate trauma to the spinal cord and massive hemorrhaging. The Toontown Tragedy. Brandon Zucker was 4 years old when he visited Disneyland with his parents on September 22, 2000. The Roger Rabbit's cartoon spin ride had been operating in the park's Toontown section for 6 years. The attraction featured spinning cartoon taxicabs that moved along a track through colorful scenes. Each vehicle could rotate 360 degrees as it progressed through the ride, controlled by a steering wheel inside the cab. Brandon, an energetic preschooler with bright eyes and brown hair, sat in the same cab as his mother. The ride began normally as their yellow taxi entered the first scene. The vehicle spun gently as Brandon's mother turned the wheel. About halfway through the attraction, as the cab made a sharp turn, something went terribly wrong. The small opening between the bottom of the cab door and the ride floor was approximately 7 inches, just large enough for a child's body to pass through. In a moment of excitement or imbalance, Brandon slipped down from his seat. Before his mother could react, he slid through the gap beneath the door. The vehicle's momentum dragged him immediately under the moving cab. The metal undercarriage, weighing over 700 pounds, rolled over Brandon's small body. The crushing force caused catastrophic compression injuries to his chest and abdomen. Most devastating was the oxygen deprivation to his brain, which began the moment his chest was crushed. For approximately 3 minutes, Brandon remained pinned beneath the taxi as the ride continued to operate. Other guests heard his mother's screams but couldn't understand what was happening in the darkened attraction. When operators finally stopped the ride and emergency personnel reached him, Brandon was unconscious. His pulse was faint, his breathing almost imperceptible. Paramedics performed CPR as they rushed him to the hospital. Brandon survived the initial trauma but had suffered irreversible brain damage. For the next 9 years, he remained in a persistent vegetative state, kept alive by feeding tubes and constant care. His body grew, but his mind never recovered. Medical experts explained that each day, his brain cells continued to die from the original injury. On January 26, 2009, at age 13, Brandon's body finally succumbed to pneumonia, a direct complication of his bedridden condition. The official cause of death was listed as complications from anoxic encephalopathy, brain damage caused by oxygen deprivation nearly a decade earlier. Christmas Eve Catastrophe. Luan Fee Dawson was 33 years old when he visited Disneyland with his family on December 24, 1998. The holiday crowds filled the park as Dawson, his wife Lu Tui Vuong, and their daughter gathered near the sailing ship Columbia attraction. The Columbia was a full-scale replica of an 18th century sailing vessel that circled the rivers of America. The ship, weighing over 110 tons, was secured to the dock by heavy ropes attached to metal cleats bolted into the wooden deck. At approximately 6:15 p.m., as guests were boarding for the next journey, a cast member attempted to secure one of the mooring lines. The rope being used was not the specified marine-grade nylon, but a cheaper, less flexible polyester substitute that had been installed during recent maintenance. As the massive ship pulled against its moorings, the rope suddenly went taut with over 2,000 pounds of pressure. The strain proved too much for the substandard material. With a sound like a rifle shot, the rope snapped. The release tension sent the heavy metal cleat flying through the air at nearly 100 miles per hour. The 8-pound brass fixture became a deadly projectile, ripping free from its mounting bolts and spinning wildly toward the crowd of waiting guests. Dawson had no time to react. The metal cleat struck him directly in the skull, just above his right temple. The impact crushed his cranial bone inward with such force that bone fragments penetrated 3 inches into his brain. The traumatic injury severed blood vessels and destroyed critical brain tissue instantly. Neurologists later explained that while death was not immediate, consciousness was lost within milliseconds, as intracranial pressure spiked catastrophically. Blood poured from the wound as Dawson collapsed onto the festively decorated dock. His wife, standing just beside him, was also struck by the projectile as it ricocheted. The cleat tore through her cheekbone and jaw, leaving her critically injured but alive. Their young daughter watched in horror as both parents fell. Emergency medical technicians reached Dawson within minutes, but the injury was unsurvivable. Despite being rushed to the nearby UC Irvine Medical Center, he was pronounced dead at 8:48 p.m. Just as Christmas Eve celebrations around the park were reaching their peak, his death marked the first guest fatality at Disneyland directly attributable to mechanical failure rather than guest behavior or pre-existing medical conditions. PeopleMover Tunnel Crush. Ricky Lee Yama was 17 years old when he visited Disneyland on a warm August day in 1967. The PeopleMover attraction, which had opened just the previous year, was a futuristic transportation system that offered guests a leisurely journey through Tomorrowland. The ride consisted of small 4-person cars that moved continuously along an elevated track at a steady 5 miles per hour. There were no doors on the vehicles, just open sides that allowed guests to easily enter and exit at the loading platform. Ricky was with friends that afternoon enjoying the park's attractions. Witnesses later reported seeing the teenagers engaging in horseplay near the PeopleMover, possibly daring each other to jump between moving cars. This dangerous activity wasn't uncommon among thrill-seeking teens, despite clear warnings against it. As the train of connected cars entered a dark tunnel section near the Adventure Through Inner Space attraction, Ricky made his fateful decision. With his friends watching, he leapt from the platform toward a moving car. The gap between cars was only 18 inches, seemingly easy to cross. But Ricky mistimed his jump. His foot caught the edge of a car, causing him to lose balance. He tumbled downward, falling directly onto the moving track below. The fall itself wasn't far, just 4 feet, but the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Before Ricky could regain his footing in the darkened tunnel, the next train of PeopleMover cars rounded the bend. The front edge of the first car struck his body, knocking him flat against the track. The undercarriage, with its wheels and mechanical components, passed directly over him. The weight of the car crushed his ribcage, puncturing his lungs and heart, but death didn't come instantly. As Ricky lay injured on the track, unable to move, additional cars continued to pass over him. Each one inflicted new trauma to his already broken body. The ride's mechanical system, designed to move continuously, dragged him along the track for approximately 340 feet through the dark tunnel. Other guests, seated in cars passing through the same tunnel, heard his screams but couldn't see what was happening in the darkness below. When ride operators finally received word of a problem and stopped the attraction, emergency responders found Ricky's body mangled beyond recognition. The medical examiner later determined that he had remained conscious for at least 40 seconds after the initial impact, experiencing the full horror of being crushed and dragged before blood loss and organ damage finally ended his suffering. Monorail track Trespass. Thomas Guy Cleveland was 19 years old on June 7, 1966, when he attempted to sneak into Disneyland during the park's annual Grad Night celebration. The special after-hours event was restricted to high school graduates with valid tickets, which Cleveland did not have. Determined to join his friends inside, he devised a plan to bypass the main entrance. The Disneyland Hotel sat just outside park property, separated from Tomorrowland by a 16-foot security fence topped with barbed wire. Around 1 o'clock a.m., Cleveland scaled this imposing barrier, ignoring the clear warning signs posted along its length. The teenager successfully cleared the barbed wire and dropped down onto what appeared to be an empty service road. What he failed to realize was that he had landed directly on the Disneyland Allweg monorail track, an elevated concrete beam that carried the futuristic trains between the hotel and the park. Cleveland began walking along the narrow beam toward Tomorrowland. The concrete track was only 32 inches wide, leaving little room for error. A security guard spotted him and immediately shouted warnings to get down. Cleveland either didn't hear or chose to ignore these calls. He continued forward, unaware that Monorail Red was approaching from behind at approximately 30 miles per hour on its regular late-night circuit. The train's operator spotted Cleveland too late to stop. The monorail, weighing several tons, struck the teenager with tremendous force. The impact shattered his spine and fractured his skull instantly. His body was thrown forward but became caught beneath the front of the train. For approximately 70 feet, Cleveland was dragged along the rough concrete beam, his skin and clothing torn away by the abrasive surface. The friction created by his body against the track actually helped slow the monorail to a stop. When emergency responders reached the scene, they found Cleveland's remains wedged beneath the first car. Medical examiners later determined that while the initial impact caused catastrophic injuries, Cleveland had not died instantly. Blood evidence indicated his heart continued beating for nearly 2 minutes as he was dragged along the track, conscious enough to experience the excruciating pain of having his body systematically shredded by the concrete. The nighttime darkness and the elevation of the track meant that many guests inside the park remained unaware of the tragedy unfolding above them. Cleveland's death occurred as graduation celebrations continued nearby. The juxtaposition of youthful celebration and grim mortality separated by just a few dozen feet of air. Ateeq Rafiq incident. On March 9, 2018, a routine trip to the movies ended in tragedy at the View Cinema in Star City, Birmingham, UK. A 24-year-old father had just finished watching a film with his wife when he realized his phone and keys were missing. He suspected they had fallen between his seat and the floor. The gold-class seats in the theater were premium recliners, equipped with powered footrests that could be adjusted with the push of a button for maximum comfort. As he knelt down and reached under the seat, the powered footrest began to lower automatically. Within seconds, his head became trapped between the metal mechanism and the floor. The pressure immediately cut off his ability to breathe properly. His wife and theater staff desperately tried to free him, but the electric mechanism wouldn't release. Investigators later discovered a blown fuse in the seat's power system had caused a critical malfunction. The safety features that should have prevented the footrest from applying lethal pressure had failed completely. For nearly 15 minutes, he remained pinned under the crushing weight of the metal footrest as his brain was starved of oxygen. By the time emergency services arrived and managed to dismantle the seat, he had already suffered catastrophic hypoxic brain damage. Paramedics found him in cardiac arrest. He was rushed to Heartland's Hospital where doctors placed him on life support, but the injury was too severe. After a week in intensive care with no signs of recovery, Ateeq Rafiq was pronounced dead on March 16th. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death as catastrophic brain injuries resulting from compression of the neck. Knickerbocker Theater roof collapse incident. On January 28, 1922, Washington, D.C. was experiencing one of the worst blizzards in its history. Snow had been falling heavily for days, accumulating on rooftops across the city. Despite the weather, the Knickerbocker Theater on 18th Street and Columbia Road was packed with nearly 1,000 people that Saturday evening. The audience had gathered to watch the comedy film Get Rich Quick Wallingford in what was considered one of the most elegant movie houses in the district. At precisely 9:10 p.m., as the film played, a strange cracking sound echoed through the theater. Some patrons glanced up toward the ceiling. Moments later, the entire concrete roof collapsed inward without warning. The flat roof had collected over 28 inches of snow, weighing approximately 80 pounds per square foot. The tremendous weight had overcome the structural limits of the building. Hundreds of tons of concrete, steel, and snow crashed down directly onto the seated audience below. The impact was immediate and devastating. Those in the balcony seats were crushed instantly by the falling debris. Others on the main floor were trapped beneath massive concrete slabs. The theater plunged into darkness as electrical lines were severed. Screams filled the air as survivors struggled to escape through the chaos. Emergency responders arrived within minutes but faced a horrific scene. They worked through the night in freezing temperatures, pulling bodies from the rubble. 98 people were killed outright or died shortly after being extracted. Another 133 suffered severe crushing injuries. The weight that had provided them shelter had become the instrument of their death. Morumbi shopping, cinema shooting incident. On November 3, 1999, the Morumbi shopping mall in Sao Paulo, Brazil, was bustling with its usual weekday crowd. Inside Cinema 5, approximately 40 people had settled in to watch Fight Club, a film about violence and psychological breakdown. Among them were Herme Luisa Jatoba Vadaz, a 40-year-old psychologist, Fabiana Lobão Freitas, a 22-year-old student, and Julio Mauricio Zemaitis, a 44-year-old businessman. Unknown to them, seated in the audience was Mateus da Costa Meira, a 24-year-old medical student from a wealthy family. He had entered the theater carrying a tennis bag. Approximately 30 minutes into the film, during a scene depicting violence, Meira stood up from his seat. In the darkness of the theater, he calmly removed a 9mm Cobra M11 submachine gun from his bag. Without saying a word, he began firing indiscriminately into the crowd. The first burst of gunfire lasted only seconds, but released 29 bullets into the darkened theater. The sound of gunshots initially confused many patrons, who thought it was part of the film. This momentary hesitation proved fatal. The high-velocity rounds tore through seats and bodies alike. Panic erupted as people realized what was happening. Some crawled on the floor seeking cover while others rushed toward the exits. Meira continued firing until he was tackled by several patrons. By then, the damage was done. Herme died instantly from bullets to her head and chest. Fabiana and Julio suffered multiple gunshot wounds and died shortly after arriving at nearby hospitals. 7 others were seriously injured but survived. Police later found 160 unfired bullets in Meira's possession, enough to have killed everyone in the theater. Laurier Palace Theater fire incident. On January 9, 1927, a freezing Sunday afternoon in Montreal, Quebec, the Laurier Palace Theatre was filled with approximately 800 people, most of them children under 16 years old. The theater, located in a working-class neighborhood, was showing the comedy film Get 'Em Young. Many children had been dropped off by parents for the 2 p.m. matinee, a common weekend practice. At approximately 2:15 p.m., a small fire started beneath the wooden balcony, likely from a discarded cigarette. Smoke began to rise visibly in the darkened theater, when children in the balcony noticed and began to move toward exits. The ushers initially tried to maintain order by directing them back to their seats, insisting there was no danger. This fatal delay allowed the fire to spread rapidly through the aging wooden structure. Panic erupted minutes later as thick smoke filled the theater. Hundreds of children rushed toward the main exit at once. The theater had 6 exits, but only one was properly marked, and all doors opened inward, a critical design flaw that proved deadly when pressed upon by the weight of panicked children. At the eastern stairwell, the main escape route, children piled on top of each other as they tried to flee. The pressure of bodies against the doors made them impossible to open. Those at the bottom of the pile were crushed or asphyxiated within minutes. When firefighters finally broke through, they found a tangled mass of bodies on the stairs. 78 children died in the disaster, 12 from burns, the rest from being crushed or suffocated. Many were found still clutching their ticket stubs in their hands. Dream City Cinema Club, arson incident. On February 26, 1994, a small adult cinema in London's Clerkenwell district was operating illegally after hours. Dream City Cinema Club occupied the ground floor of a 4-story building on St. John Street. Inside, approximately 50 men were watching films in the darkness. The venue had no proper fire safety equipment, emergency lighting, or adequate exits. David Laurier, a 39-year-old homeless man known locally as Deaf Dave, arrived at the club that evening after being ejected because he couldn't pay the £5 entrance fee. He became enraged. Laurier walked to a nearby service station, purchased a container of petrol, and returned to the cinema around 2 a.m. Without hesitation, he poured the fuel across the entrance and ignited it. The fire spread with extraordinary speed through the venue's narrow corridors. The front entrance, now engulfed in flames, was the only way in or out of the building. Inside, patrons were initially unaware of the danger until smoke began pouring into the screening room. Panic erupted as men rushed toward the burning entrance. The lack of emergency lighting meant they were navigating through near total darkness. Those who reached the front door faced a wall of flames. Some tried to break through windows but found them barred. Within minutes, the toxic smoke had filled the entire space. Victims collapsed from smoke inhalation before they could find an escape route. Firefighters arrived quickly but found the entrance completely blocked by fire. By the time emergency services gained access, 8 men had already died from smoke inhalation. 3 more would die in hospital in the following days. The victims were found huddled together in corners, their lungs filled with toxic fumes. Palace Cinema Theatre Death Incident. On December 12, 2024, a small theater in Rayadurgam, Andhra Pradesh, was packed with fans eager to see Pushpa 2: The Rule, one of India's most anticipated films of the year. Among those attending the early afternoon matinee was a 35-year-old laborer from Udegalam village. The father of 4 had traveled to the Palace Cinema Theatre specifically to see the action blockbuster starring Allu Arjun. Witnesses later reported that he appeared visibly intoxicated when he entered the theater shortly before the 2 p.m. showing. He took his seat in the rear section of the auditorium, away from most other patrons. As the 3-hour film played, other audience members noticed him slumped in his chair, but assumed he was merely sleeping off his intoxication. When the film ended and lights came up around 5 p.m., the theater emptied quickly. Staff began preparing for the evening screening scheduled for 6 p.m., but did not thoroughly check each row of seats. It wasn't until a cleaner was sweeping between screenings that Marianappa's body was discovered, still seated upright in the chair where he had been throughout the film. Medical examiners later determined he had died approximately 2 hours into the screening. The combination of severe alcohol intoxication and an undiagnosed heart condition had proven fatal. Despite the discovery, theater management made the decision to continue with the evening screening as scheduled. The body remained in the theater, covered with a sheet in the back row, while new patrons filed in for the 6 p.m. show. It was only after family members arrived following notification that his body was finally removed. By then, the next screening was already underway, with audience members unaware of the death that had occurred just meters away. Cinema Lift Tragedy. On September 24, 2025, the PVR Escape Multiplex in Chennai's Express Avenue Mall was preparing for its morning screenings. While most theaters were still empty, Screen 4 had one occupant, Ramesh Kumar, a 39-year-old maintenance worker employed by the cinema for over 7 years. His job that morning was routine, cleaning the high ceiling panels and checking the surround sound speakers mounted near the top of the screen. At approximately 7:15 a.m., Ramesh positioned a hydraulic scissor lift beneath the main screen. The machine was designed to elevate workers safely to heights of up to 12 meters. Ramesh had used this equipment hundreds of times before. He stepped onto the metal platform and activated the control panel, rising slowly toward the ceiling. Witnesses in the projection room later reported hearing an unusual grinding noise from the lift's hydraulic system. The theater's assistant manager, who had just entered to check on progress, saw Ramesh reaching up to clean a speaker panel when something went catastrophically wrong. Without warning, the lift's safety mechanism failed. A critical hydraulic line ruptured, causing pressure to build in the remaining functional cylinder. The platform suddenly jerked upward with tremendous force. Ramesh had no time to react. His body was caught between the rising metal frame and the rigid ceiling structure. The impact was devastating. The edge of the platform compressed his chest with a force exceeding 1,000 kilograms per square inch. Medical experts later explained that this immediate pressure shattered his ribcage, driving bone fragments into his lungs and heart. Simultaneously, his head was crushed against a ceiling beam, causing catastrophic skull fracture and immediate brain hemorrhage. For several seconds, Ramesh remained conscious, experiencing excruciating pain as his internal organs were compressed. His lungs, unable to expand, could draw no breath. Blood vessels in his brain ruptured from the immense pressure. Those few moments of awareness would have been filled with unimaginable agony before oxygen deprivation to his brain mercifully rendered him unconscious. The assistant manager rushed to the emergency stop button, but it was already too late. When first responders arrived 7 minutes later, they found Ramesh's body still pinned in position, showing no vital signs. The medical team pronounced him dead at the scene, noting that death had occurred within seconds of impact from catastrophic traumatic asphyxia and massive head trauma. The escalator horror of Hubei. On July 26, 2015, Xiang Liu Juan, a 30-year-old mother, was shopping with her 2-year-old son at a mall in Jingzhou, Hubei province, China. It was supposed to be an ordinary day of browsing stores and spending time together. The mall was busy with weekend shoppers, families moving between floors on elevators and escalators. As Xiang approached the top of an escalator on the 4th floor, something went terribly wrong. Security camera footage later showed what happened in those critical seconds. Just as she reached the top landing, the floor panel at the escalator's exit suddenly collapsed beneath her feet. In that moment, Xiang made a split-second decision that would cost her life. With remarkable maternal instinct, she pushed her toddler forward into the arms of a nearby shop assistant, who had noticed the panel starting to give way. Her son was safely thrust forward, but Xiang couldn't save herself. As the metal plate gave way completely, she fell waist-deep into the running machinery below. For nearly 5 minutes, Xiang struggled against the escalator's mechanical grip. The moving stairs continued to run, pulling her deeper into the works. Witnesses reported hearing her screams echoing through the mall as she was slowly dragged downward. The metal teeth of the machinery tore through flesh and bone while horrified onlookers watched helplessly. Mall staff had no emergency shutoff procedure to follow. By the time technicians arrived to dismantle the escalator, Xiang was already dead. The autopsy revealed she suffered massive internal injuries as the mechanism crushed her internal organs while she was still conscious. Blood loss alone would have been fatal, but the mechanical trauma was catastrophic. An investigation later found that maintenance workers had removed the floor panel earlier that day and failed to secure it properly before reopening the escalator to the public. They had not even placed warning signs around the area. The false ceiling tragedy. Sunil and Chandru. On December 12, 2019, 2 young men arrived at BM Habitat Mall in Mysuru, India, for what should have been routine maintenance work. Sunil, 35, from Niralagupi village, and Chandru, 22, from Gokulam, were hired to replace advertising banners on the 4th floor of the bustling shopping center. Both men were experienced in this type of work, having done similar jobs across the city. The task required them to access a section above a false ceiling made of plaster of Paris. Before they began, their supervisor explicitly warned them about the danger. Don't step on the false ceiling, he told them firmly. It won't support your weight. The ceiling was designed only for aesthetic purposes, not to bear any significant load. But in a fatal miscalculation, the warning went unheeded. At approximately 11:30 a.m., security cameras captured the 2 men climbing above the decorative ceiling. Witnesses reported hearing Chandru joke about taking a shortcut across the plaster surface rather than walking around to the proper maintenance platform. Sunil followed his younger colleague's lead. The weight of both men on the fragile material was catastrophic. Without warning, the ceiling gave way beneath them. Shoppers below looked up at the sound of cracking plaster to see 2 human forms plummeting through the air. The men fell nearly 40 feet, screaming as they dropped through empty space. The impact on the hard tile floor below was devastating. Medical reports later confirmed that neither died instantly. Chandru suffered multiple compound fractures, his bones protruding through his skin as he lay conscious on the mall floor. Sunil's skull fractured on impact, causing massive cerebral hemorrhaging. Mall patrons watched in horror as both men gasped for breath, blood pooling beneath their broken bodies. Emergency services arrived within minutes, but the internal injuries were too severe. Both men died before reaching the hospital, their bodies so mangled that family members later struggled to identify them. The Yunnan service lift disaster. On July 26, 2013, a crowded shopping mall in Yunnan province, China, was filled with weekend shoppers seeking relief from the summer heat. In the back corridors of the building, away from the polished floors and bright displays, was a service elevator. It was designed solely for moving inventory and equipment, not people. Signs clearly marked it as a freight lift, with warnings against passenger use. Despite these restrictions, the lift had become an unofficial shortcut for both employees and shoppers wanting to avoid the long waits for passenger elevators. That afternoon, 20 people crowded into the small metal box, more than doubling its intended capacity. Among them were 2 mall employees and 18 shoppers, including 3 children. The service elevator began its ascent from the first floor. As it reached the 3rd floor, witnesses in the hallway reported hearing an ominous mechanical grinding. Then came a sharp snap, the sound of the main cable breaking. For a fraction of a second, the elevator hung suspended. Then it plummeted. Inside the falling box, passengers were briefly weightless before being slammed against the ceiling as the emergency brakes engaged, then failed. One survivor later described the sensation as like having your insides tear away from your body. The elevator crashed into the basement level at devastating speed. The impact crushed those at the bottom of the car instantly. 3 people, a 45-year-old woman, a 32-year-old man, and a 24-year-old female employee, were killed by massive compressive forces. Autopsies revealed shattered pelvic bones, crushed internal organs, and traumatic aortic ruptures. The man lived for nearly 4 minutes after impact, drowning in his own blood as his punctured lungs filled with fluid. 17 others suffered serious injuries, severed limbs, spinal damage, and traumatic brain injuries. Rescuers described the scene as a metal coffin filled with broken bodies. Blood seeped under the elevator doors as mall security attempted to pry them open with crowbars. A subsequent investigation revealed that the lift had not been inspected for 3 years, despite regulations requiring annual maintenance. The Miraflores Mall Plunge, Ana Lucia Menendez. On December 18, 2022, a 22-year-old kiosk worker was arranging Christmas ornaments at her small jewelry stand in Guatemala City's popular Miraflores Mall. Anna had been employed there for just 3 months, saving money to continue her university studies. 4 floors above, in the mall's rooftop parking area, 19-year-old Diego Velasquez was arguing with his girlfriend in his father's sedan. Witnesses reported seeing the young man rev the engine in anger before suddenly accelerating. The car shot forward at high speed, crashing through the concrete safety barrier designed to prevent vehicles from approaching the edge. The sedan became airborne, plunging through the thin metal sheeting that formed the mall's decorative roof. The impact tore a massive hole in the ceiling. For a brief moment, shoppers looked up in confusion at the sudden sound of tearing metal. Then, 3,000 pounds of metal and glass fell directly toward the ground floor. Anna had only enough time to look upward before the vehicle crashed onto her kiosk. The car landed with such force that it continued through the tile floor into the basement level. Security camera footage showed Anna disappearing beneath the wreckage in an instant. The sound echoed throughout the mall like a bomb detonation. First responders arrived within minutes. They found Anna crushed beneath the mangled vehicle, her body so severely compressed that it was initially mistaken for debris. Medical examiners later determined she had survived the initial impact, suffering catastrophic internal injuries. Her lungs had been punctured by shattered ribs, her skull fractured in multiple places, and her spinal column severed. For approximately 2 minutes, she remained conscious, gasping for breath as shoppers frantically tried to lift the wreckage off her body. Blood pooled around the destroyed kiosk as rescuers worked. By the time they freed her, Anna had already died from traumatic asphyxiation. Remarkably, Diego Velasquez survived with only moderate injury. The blue sapphire ceiling collapse, Harendra Badi and Shaquille. On July 19, 2020, 2 men were enjoying a Sunday afternoon at Blue Sapphire Mall in Greater Noida, India. Harendra, a 42-year-old software engineer, was shopping for his daughter's birthday present. Shaquille, 37, worked as an accountant and had come to meet a friend for coffee. Neither man knew the other as they passed near the main escalator on the ground floor. Above them, extending 5 stories up, was an elaborate decorative ceiling made of heavy iron grille panels. Each panel weighed approximately 80 pounds and had been installed during the mall's renovation 2 years earlier. Maintenance records would later show that the ceiling fixtures had been flagged for improper installation during an inspection 4 months prior, but no repairs had been made. At 3:17 p.m., as both men happened to walk beneath the same section of ceiling, security cameras captured a sudden movement above. Without warning, 3 massive iron panels broke free from their moorings. Shoppers on upper floors reported hearing a metallic scraping sound, followed by the panels tearing away completely. The heavy grills plummeted 5 floors, gaining deadly velocity. Harendra looked up at the last second, raising his hands in a futile protective gesture. Shaquille never saw it coming. The metal struck both men with devastating force. The impact was so severe that the iron panels bent around their bodies. Mall security rushed to the scene to find both men still alive, crushed beneath the twisted metal. Blood spread across the polished floor as other shoppers attempted to lift the heavy grills. Harendra was conscious, screaming in agony as the jagged edges of the panels cut deeper into his torso with each movement. His ribcage had been shattered on impact, sending bone fragments into his lungs and heart. Shaquille had suffered a catastrophic head injury. injury. The metal had struck him directly on the skull, fracturing it in 16 places. He lay motionless except for irregular gasping breaths. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes, but by then, both men had already died from their injuries. Mall management later blamed strong winds for the collapse, despite the indoor location. The Avenue Mall parking lot tragedy. Kathy Pendergrass. On December 23, 2024, a 61-year-old retired nurse was helping a stranger at the Avenue Mall in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The mall was crowded with holiday shoppers rushing to complete their Christmas purchases. Pendergrass had noticed an elderly man struggling with his wheelchair near the main entrance and offered her assistance. As she guided the wheelchair toward the man's parked vehicle, 78-year-old Raymond Donaldson was backing his modified Honda CR-V out of a nearby parking space. Donaldson had suffered a stroke 3 months earlier, which had left him with partial paralysis in his left side. His vehicle had been altered to accommodate his disability, but he was still adjusting to the modified controls. Security footage later showed Donaldson becoming confused as he reversed. Instead of pressing the brake pedal, he mistakenly pushed the accelerator with increasing force. The SUV, which had been converted for postal delivery with reinforced bumpers and a strengthened frame, suddenly shot backward at high speed. Pendergrass, focused on helping the man in the wheelchair, never saw the vehicle coming. The CR-V slammed into a parked car, creating a narrow space with Pendergrass caught between the two vehicles. The impact crushed her midsection with such force that witnesses reported hearing the sickening sound of bones breaking above the screech of tires. Donaldson, still confused and now panicking, continued to press the accelerator. The SUV's wheels spun against the asphalt as the vehicle compressed Pendergrass further against the parked car. Her pelvis was shattered instantly, and her spinal cord was severed at the L3 vertebra. Despite the catastrophic injuries, she remained conscious, screaming in agony as internal bleeding began immediately. Bystanders finally managed to alert Donaldson, who released the accelerator. Emergency services arrived within minutes and rushed Pendergrass to Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Doctors performed emergency surgery, but the internal damage was too extensive. For 5 days, she fought for her life in the ICU, suffering multiple organ failures as her body struggled to cope with the trauma. On December 28, 2024, Kathy Pendergrass died of complications from her injuries. The boxing machine crush. On September 8, 2017, a night out in Quebec City ended in unimaginable tragedy for a 19-year-old man. Patrick Desbian had been enjoying himself at Le Pub Galway, a popular nightclub where patrons often tested their strength on arcade games between drinks. The venue featured a boxing machine, a 350-pound arcade attraction designed to measure punching power with a spring-loaded pad. At approximately 1:15 a.m., witnesses reported seeing Desbian hanging from the top of the machine. He was laughing, showing off for friends. The heavy unit wasn't bolted to the floor as recommended by the manufacturer. Within seconds, the massive machine began to tilt forward. Security camera footage, later reviewed by police, showed the machine's center of gravity shifting past the critical point. The boxing machine, with its metal frame and heavy internal components, crashed down onto Desbian with devastating force. The impact pinned him to the floor, the full weight of the machine crushing his chest and abdomen. Patrons immediately rushed to help. 3 men struggled to lift the machine while the others called for emergency services. For nearly 2 minutes, Desbian remained conscious, gasping for breath beneath the crushing weight. Each inhale became more desperate than the last as his ribs fractured and compressed his lungs. Medical experts later determined that Desbian suffered massive internal hemorrhaging. His liver had ruptured, spilling blood into his abdominal cavity. His aorta, the body's main artery, was partially torn from the impact. Each heartbeat pumped more blood into spaces where it couldn't sustain life. When paramedics arrived 7 minutes after the accident, they found Desbian unresponsive. Despite their efforts to stabilize him before transport, his blood pressure had dropped too low. He was pronounced dead at 2:04 a.m. at l'Hôpital de l'Enfant Jésus. Quebec authorities opened a negligent homicide investigation, focusing on the nightclub's failure to secure the machine according to safety protocols. For the other patrons, what began as an ordinary night of fun became a horrifying memory of preventable death. Arcade Massacre in Uruapan, February 3, 2020. The afternoon started like any other at the Adrenaline video game arcade in Uruapan, Mexico. Located in a working-class neighborhood, the arcade was a gathering spot for local teenagers and young adults seeking an escape from the violence that had gripped Michoacan state. At 3:15 p.m., the arcade hummed with activity, as approximately 20 people played games and socialized. 3 men in dark clothing entered through the front door. Witnesses would later describe them as wearing tactical vests, bearing the initials CJNG, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Without warning, they drew .45 caliber handguns and AK-47 rifles, demanding to know if anyone belonged to rival cartels. Before anyone could respond, they opened fire. The first victims were 2 12-year-old boys playing near the entrance. The high-velocity rounds tore through their small bodies, causing catastrophic internal damage. Medical examiners later found that one boy had 5 separate entry wounds, including one that severed his spinal cord at the base of the skull. Despite this devastating injury, His heart continued beating for nearly 40 seconds as blood flooded his lungs. A 14-year-old girl tried to hide behind an arcade cabinet. Security camera footage showed her crouching down, eyes wide with terror. 3 bullets struck her in the abdomen and chest. She remained conscious through the attack, clutching her wounds as blood soaked through her school uniform. She died from hemorrhagic shock before emergency services arrived. The gunman methodically moved through the arcade, firing over 65 rounds in less than 2 minutes. The bullets shattered glass, penetrated metal cabinets, and struck 9 people. Among them, a 17-year-old cashier who was shot in the face as he attempted to call police from behind the counter. First responders arrived to find bodies slumped over gaming controls, some still clutching joysticks in a macabre tableau. Blood pooled beneath the flashing screens that continued to play animations, oblivious to the massacre that had just occurred. Fish Arcade Betrayal. On April 21, 2018, a routine shift at the Fishzilla arcade in Salisbury, North Carolina turned deadly. Davis, a 45-year-old arcade attendant, had been working at the establishment for just over 3 months. The Fishzilla was one of many fish game arcades that operate in legal gray areas throughout the state, offering casino-style gambling through colorful underwater-themed video games. At approximately 9:17 p.m., surveillance cameras captured Dedrick Michelle Mason entering the arcade. The 26-year-old woman appeared agitated, pacing near the entrance before approaching Davis at the counter. Words were exchanged, their conversation growing increasingly heated. Witnesses later testified that the argument concerned money Mason believed she had won earlier that day. What began as a verbal confrontation quickly escalated. Mason suddenly reached into her purse and pulled out a .38 caliber revolver. Davis raised his hands, backing away from the counter. The security footage showed a moment of hesitation, a split second where Davis appeared to recognize what was about to happen. The first shot struck Davis in the abdomen, just below his ribcage. The hollow point bullet expanded on impact, tearing through his liver and part of his small intestine before lodging near his spine. Davis collapsed behind the counter, conscious and in shock. Mason fired a second time, the bullet grazing Davis's shoulder before embedding in the wall. Patrons scattered in panic. Mason fled the scene as Davis lay bleeding on the arcade floor. First responders arrived within minutes, finding Davis still conscious but struggling to breathe as blood filled his abdominal cavity. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize him, applying pressure bandages and administering intravenous fluids to combat the rapidly developing hypovolemic shock. Davis remained conscious during the ambulance ride, repeatedly asking medics if he was going to die. At Novant Health Rowan Medical Center, surgeons operated for over 5 hours to repair the extensive internal damage. Despite their efforts, Davis's condition deteriorated throughout the night. His organs, deprived of adequate blood flow for too long, began to fail one by one. At 6:23 a.m. the following morning, James Christopher Davis was pronounced dead. Crystal Beach Tragedy. On July 12, 2019, a family vacation in Crystal Beach, Texas turned into an unimaginable nightmare for the Stevenson family. 2-year-old Lucas had been excited all day, running between the windows of their rented beach house to look at the ocean. His parents had chosen the luxury vacation home specifically because it advertised family-friendly amenities, including a game room with several arcade machines. That evening, while his mother prepared dinner, Lucas wandered into the game room unsupervised. The room contained a vintage whack-a-mole arcade machine, a 220-pound cabinet made of particle board, metal, and glass. Unlike modern arcades, these vacation rental machines were rarely secured to the floor. Security camera footage later revealed that Lucas approached the colorful machine, attracted by its flashing demo screen. The toddler, just learning to climb, grabbed the control panel and pulled himself upward. For a brief moment, Lucas balanced on the front edge of the machine, his small hands reaching for the mallet attached by a cord. The shift in weight was subtle but catastrophic. The top-heavy arcade cabinet began to tilt forward. There was no time for Lucas to move away. The massive machine toppled, pinning the child underneath its crushing weight. The impact was direct and severe. The sharp metal edge of the control panel struck Lucas across his chest and abdomen. His mother, hearing the crash, rushed into the room. She found Lucas trapped, only his legs visible beneath the fallen machine. Her screams brought Lucas's father, who struggled desperately to lift the cabinet. When he finally managed to free his son, Lucas was unconscious, his breathing shallow and labored. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes and immediately recognized the severity of the internal injuries. The impact had ruptured Lucas's liver and caused severe crushing damage to his ribs and lungs. Despite being intubated at the scene, Lucas's oxygen levels continued to drop as blood filled the spaces around his lungs. The helicopter flight to the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston took only 18 minutes, but Lucas's condition deteriorated rapidly. His small body, unable to compensate for the massive internal hemorrhaging, went into hypovolemic shock. Surgeons worked frantically to control the bleeding, but the damage was too extensive. At 9:42 p.m., just 4 hours after the accident, Lucas Stevenson's heart stopped beating. Fire in Tangshan Arcade. On December 11, 2003, an unremarkable building in the industrial city of Tangshan, China, housed what locals knew was an illegal video game arcade. Operating without proper licenses, the basement facility had been converted from a storage area into a cramped gaming center with over 30 machines. The owner, seeking to maximize profits, had packed the machines tightly together, leaving narrow pathways between them. That afternoon, the arcade was filled with teenagers who had just finished school. Most were between 13 and 16 years old, drawn to the affordable entertainment. At approximately 3:15 p.m., an electrical panel in the back of the room began to smoke. Years of dust accumulation and unauthorized wiring modifications had created the perfect conditions for disaster. The first flames appeared small and containable. However, the arcade owner had removed several sprinklers to prevent water damage to the machines. Within minutes, the fire reached a stack of plastic chairs and tables stored near the electrical panel. Black toxic smoke began to fill the low-ceilinged room. The temperature rose rapidly as the synthetic materials combusted, releasing cyanide compounds into the air. The 37 people inside immediately rushed toward the main entrance. What should have been an orderly evacuation quickly turned chaotic when they discovered the reality of their situation. The owner had locked the fire exit to prevent customers from sneaking in without paying. The windows had been covered with metal bars to deter theft. The only way out was a single door at the top of a narrow staircase. As smoke filled the room, visibility dropped to near zero. Those nearest the exit pushed forward in panic. A stampede formed at the bottom of the stairs. Security camera footage later recovered showed teenagers gasping for breath as the oxygen levels plummeted. Several fell unconscious within 2 minutes of the fire's start, still meters from the exit. The first victim was a 14-year-old boy who collapsed from smoke inhalation. Medical examiners later determined he remained conscious for nearly a minute on the floor, his lungs burning with every breath as the toxic fumes caused his airways to swell shut. Others suffered similar fates, dropping one by one as the smoke became unbearable. Firefighters arrived 7 minutes after the first alarm, but by then the basement had become a crematorium. They found bodies piled near the staircase, evidence of the desperate final moments. In total, 17 people died, most of them young students who had sought only an afternoon of entertainment. The Osaka Inferno. At 3:00 a.m. on October 1st, 2008, Osaka's entertainment district was still alive with activity. Among the late-night establishments was Katz, an adult video arcade tucked away in a narrow alley of the Naniwa ward. The 3-story building housed private video booths where patrons could watch adult content in isolation. That night, approximately 32 people were inside, most of them men who had come after finishing late shifts or drinking at nearby bars. Among them was Hirokatsu Egawa, a 45-year-old office worker who had stopped in after an evening with colleagues. The building's interior was a maze of small rooms and narrow hallways. Fire inspectors had cited the establishment multiple times for safety violations, but the owner had made only minimal changes to address their concerns. At 3:07 a.m., security cameras captured a man entering the first floor with a paper bag. Inside was a container of gasoline. He walked directly to a stairwell, poured the accelerant, and ignited it with a lighter. Within seconds, the flames spread up the staircase, fed by the building's wood-paneled walls and synthetic carpeting. The fire triggered no alarms. The owner had disabled the system months earlier after complaints that false alarms were disrupting business. The first indication for patrons on the upper floors came when smoke began seeping under doors. By then, the main stairwell was already engulfed. On the third floor, Egawa noticed the smoke and opened his booth door. The hallway was filling rapidly with thick black fumes. He moved toward what should have been an emergency exit, only to find it padlocked. The owner had secured it to prevent non-paying customers from entering. The windows were covered with metal bars, another security measure that now became a death trap. As the temperature rose above 200 degrees Celsius, the synthetic materials in the ceiling began to melt and drip. Toxic hydrogen cyanide formed in the smoke, paralyzing the respiratory systems of those who inhaled it. Egawa managed to call emergency services on his mobile phone, gasping that he was trapped. Dispatchers could hear his breathing becoming more labored as the call continued. Firefighters arrived within minutes but faced impossible conditions. The building's single usable staircase had become a chimney, drawing flames upward. By the time they reached the third floor, Egawa and 15 others had already succumbed to smoke inhalation. Medical examiners later confirmed that most victims remained conscious for 2 to 3 minutes in the smoke, long enough to realize their fate but unable to escape it. Beijing Zoo subway station incident. On July 5, 2011, a crowded escalator at the Beijing Zoo subway station turned into a scene of chaos during morning rush hour. The station was packed with commuters, most of them office workers and students heading to their daily routines. Line 4 was one of the busiest in the city's extensive metro network, carrying thousands of passengers every hour. Among them was a boy traveling with his father and sister. At approximately 9:30 a.m., the ascending escalator made a sudden grinding noise. Witnesses described it as a metallic screech followed by what sounded like machinery breaking. Without warning, the escalator reversed direction, accelerating downward against its normal flow. People lost their balance immediately. The crowded stairway transformed into a human avalanche. The force threw passengers backward. Those at the top tumbled down, colliding with others below them. Screams filled the station as approximately 30 people fell and piled on top of each other at the bottom. The boy was caught in the worst position, near the bottom of the pile. The weight of multiple adults crushed down on his small frame. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the scene was chaotic. The boy had suffered severe internal injuries and wasn't breathing when paramedics reached him. Despite resuscitation attempts, he was pronounced dead at the hospital. His father and sister survived with injuries. Later investigation revealed a mechanical failure in the escalator's braking system. The sudden reversal had been caused by a critical malfunction in the drive chain, with the weight of passengers accelerating the deadly descent. Josh Martin Escalator Fall Incident. On May 28, 2018, what began as an ordinary evening at the Providence Place Mall in Rhode Island ended in tragedy. Josh Martin, a 45-year-old guitarist known for his work with the controversial band and metal group Failure Clinic, had spent the day shopping. The mall was moderately busy with the usual mix of families, teenagers, and adults moving between stores across its 4 levels. Around 10:45 p.m., Martin approached the escalator connecting the upper levels. Security footage later showed him in high spirits, laughing with friends. Witnesses reported that Martin began clowning around near the escalator, a behavior not uncommon for the musician known for his outrageous stage presence. He climbed onto the moving handrail of the ascending escalator and attempted to slide down while facing the opposite direction. Within seconds, Martin lost his balance. The slick metal rail provided no grip as he tried to steady himself. He toppled backward over the side, falling approximately 34 feet to the hard tile floor below. The impact was devastating. His head struck the ground with tremendous force, causing immediate and fatal trauma to his skull and brain. Nearby shoppers rushed to help, but Martin lay motionless in an expanding pool of blood. Mall security reached him within minutes and attempted first aid while calling emergency services. Paramedics arrived quickly, but found Martin unresponsive with no pulse. Despite their efforts to resuscitate him, the injuries were too severe. Josh Martin was pronounced dead at the scene, his skull fractured beyond recovery from an impulsive moment that turned fatal in seconds. Stony Point Fashion Park Maintenance Incident. On March 18, 2019, shoppers at Richmond's upscale Stony Point Fashion Park went about their day unaware of the tragedy unfolding behind the scenes. Inside the Dillard's department store, a maintenance technician was performing routine work on one of the store's escalators. The store was open, with customers browsing merchandise just feet away from where the technician accessed the maintenance hatch. At approximately 9:30 a.m., the technician began working on the escalator's internal mechanism. These machines contain a complex network of chains, gears, and moving parts hidden beneath the visible steps. The maintenance hatch provided only limited access to these components, forcing workers to position themselves awkwardly within the cramped mechanical space. Standard safety protocols required the power to be completely disconnected during such work. For reasons investigators later struggled to determine, the technician somehow fell into the internal machinery. The narrow service area, barely 3 feet wide, offered no room to maneuver if something went wrong. His body became entangled in the drive chains and comb plates that normally guide the steps along their track. The mechanical force crushed his torso and limbs, causing severe internal injuries. A store employee heard unusual sounds coming from the escalator and called for help. When other maintenance staff arrived, they found the technician trapped within the mechanism, unresponsive and showing no signs of life. Emergency responders arrived minutes later, but could only confirm what was already apparent. The technician had died instantly, his body so severely damaged by the machinery that extraction took several hours. Store officials declined to immediately release his name while authorities notified his family. Bronx subway escalator strangulation incident. On October 17, 2015, Carlos Alvarez, a 48-year-old maintenance worker, entered the Intervale Avenue subway station in the Bronx after finishing his late shift. The station was nearly empty at 4 a.m., with only a handful of early morning commuters present. Surveillance footage showed Alvarez walking normally toward the escalator that would take him to the platform level. As he stepped onto the ascending escalator, Alvarez appeared to lose his balance. Whether from fatigue or a misstep, he suddenly pitched forward, falling face first onto the moving stairs. In that critical moment, the collar of his work shirt caught in the teeth of the escalator steps where they disappeared into the comb plate at the top landing. The machinery continued its relentless movement, dragging both shirt and man along with it. The fabric tightened around Alvarez's neck as the escalator pulled more of his clothing into its mechanism. He struggled desperately, unable to reach the emergency stop button only feet away. The shirt acted like a ligature, constricting his airway while the escalator's steel steps scraped against his face and head. A passing commuter discovered him minutes later, face down at the top of the escalator, motionless. Blood pooled around his head, which had sustained massive trauma from impact with the metal cone plate. His shirt remained tightly wrapped around his neck, still partially caught in the machine. The commuter hit the emergency stop button and called for help. When paramedics arrived, they cut away the clothing but found no pulse. Carlos Alvarez had died from a combination of strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head, killed by his own clothing and the unyielding machine. Tokyo, supermarket handrail incident. On February 8, 2019, an elderly woman in her 80s entered the OK Store supermarket in the Higashi Fushimi district of Nishi, Tokyo. It was late afternoon, around 4:30 p.m., and the store was moderately busy with after-work shoppers. Security cameras captured her moving carefully through the aisles, leaning on her aluminum walker for support. She had completed her shopping and approached the escalator to return to the ground floor. At the top of the escalator, she paused briefly before maneuvering her walker onto the moving steps. Store policy recommended that elderly customers use the elevator, but many preferred the more convenient escalator. As she descended, something went wrong. Approximately halfway down, she lost her balance. The walker shifted position, causing her to stumble forward. She fell against the moving handrail, unable to regain her footing. As she neared the bottom landing, her body position became critical. The escalator's design created a narrowing gap where the handrail disappeared into the floor mechanism. The woman's neck slid into this gap as she continued her involuntary descent. The moving rubber handrail dragged her head toward the fixed metal housing where it entered the floor. The pressure against her neck increased instantly, compressing her airway and vital blood vessels. A store employee heard the abandoned walker clattering at the bottom of the escalator and rushed to investigate. They found the woman unconscious, her neck firmly trapped between the still moving handrail and the fixed housing. Despite hitting the emergency stop button immediately, the damage was done. Paramedics arrived within minutes but found no pulse. The compression had caused fatal damage to her trachea and carotid arteries, stopping blood flow to her brain. Santa Ana Central Courthouse maintenance incident. On February 28, 2005, Mark Pelletier, a 37-year-old repair technician with over a decade of experience, arrived at the Santa Ana Central Courthouse for routine escalator maintenance. The courthouse was quiet that Monday morning with only security staff and early arrivals present in the building. Pelletier had performed similar maintenance hundreds of times before at facilities throughout Orange County, California. At approximately 8:15 a.m., Pelletier accessed the mechanical compartment beneath the downward-moving escalator. The service area was extremely confined, measuring just 3 by 5 feet, with barely enough room for a person to maneuver among the machinery. Standard safety protocol required the power to be locked out during maintenance, with the key kept on the technician's person. For unknown reasons, this critical step was either skipped or failed. While Pelletier worked in the cramped space, the escalator's power suddenly activated. The massive steel mechanism began moving at full speed, with no warning. In the confined area, there was nowhere to escape. Pelletier was instantly caught between a structural support beam and the moving metal components of the drive system. The force was immense, crushing his chest and abdomen against the fixed beam. Court staff heard his screams and rushed to help, immediately hitting the emergency stop. When first responders arrived minutes later, they found Pelletier still trapped within the machinery, unresponsive. The pressure had caused massive internal injuries, rupturing major organs and crushing his ribcage. Paramedics confirmed he had no pulse. It took emergency workers over an hour to extract his body from the machinery. The medical examiner later determined that death had been nearly instantaneous from massive internal trauma and blood loss. The Kalamazoo Uber rampage. On February 20th, 2016, Jason Dalton began his shift as an Uber driver in Kalamazoo, Michigan. The 45-year-old father of two had no criminal record. Nothing about him suggested what would unfold over the next 7 hours. Dalton's first passenger that evening described him as quiet but professional. The ride was uneventful. What the passenger didn't know was that Dalton had already begun experiencing what he would later describe as the Uber app taking over his mind. He claimed a devil figure appeared on his phone, giving him instructions he couldn't refuse. At 5:42 p.m., Dalton pulled into an apartment complex parking lot. He approached Tiana Carruthers, a 25-year-old woman shielding children nearby, and opened fire with a 9mm handgun. She was struck 4 times but survived by playing dead. The children scattered, unharmed. Dalton then did something that would shock investigators. He continued accepting Uber requests, picking up passengers between shootings. A young couple entered his car just 30 minutes after he shot Carruthers. They had no idea they were sitting inches from a killer, the weapon resting beneath his seat. At 10:08 p.m., Dalton pulled into a Cracker Barrel parking lot. Inside his car, he selected his next victims at random. Richard Smith, 53, and his 17-year-old son Tyler had just left the restaurant. Dalton approached their car and fired multiple rounds at close range. Both died instantly. Minutes later, later, in the same lot, he targeted Mary Lou Nye, 62, Mary Jo Nye, 60, Dorothy Brown, 74, and Barbara Hawthorne, 68. They were sitting in two separate cars. None had time to react. The bullets shattered windows and tore through their bodies. All four women died at the scene. Between shootings, Dalton appeared calm. One passenger who rode with him during the rampage reported he drove normally, making casual small talk about his dog. He had no idea that minutes earlier, Dalton's hands on the steering wheel had pulled a trigger multiple times, ending 6 lives. Samantha Josephson. On March 29, 2019, Samantha Josephson stepped out of a bar in Columbia, South Carolina's popular Five Points district. The 21-year-old University of South Carolina senior had been separated from her friends and called an Uber to get home safely. It was just after 2 a.m. Surveillance cameras captured her waiting on the sidewalk, periodically checking her phone. When a black Chevrolet Impala pulled up, Samantha approached it. The car wasn't her Uber, but in the darkness and confusion, she made a fatal mistake. She opened the door and climbed into the back seat. What Samantha didn't notice was that the vehicle had child safety locks engaged. Once the doors closed behind her, she was trapped inside with Nathaniel Rowland, a 24-year-old who had been circling the area looking for targets. As the car pulled away from the curb, security footage showed the vehicle making a sharp turn in the wrong direction from her apartment. Inside the car, Samantha quickly realized her mistake. Phone records showed she tried to call for help. The call never connected. Rowland had already activated the child locks. When she tried to escape, the doors wouldn't open. Her struggle inside the vehicle left traces of her blood throughout the car's interior and on the blade of a knife with a double-sided edge. Forensic evidence later revealed Samantha suffered 120 separate stab wounds. The wounds were concentrated on her head, neck, face, upper body, and back. She had defensive wounds on her hands, showing she fought desperately for her life as the attack continued for several minutes inside the confined space of the vehicle. 12 hours after she disappeared, turkey hunters found her body in a remote wooded area 65 miles from Columbia. She had been dumped among the trees, partially clothed. Investigators determined she had bled out alone in the darkness. 2 months earlier, Samantha had written in a letter, "Education is something no one can take away from you." She was just weeks away from graduating and had been accepted to law school at Drexel University. Pittsburgh Uber driver ambush. On February 11, 2022, Christy Spicuzza ended her regular evening shift as an Uber driver and prepared to head home to her family. The 38-year-old mother of 4 had been driving for the ride-sharing company to supplement her income. At 9:14 p.m., she accepted one final request that appeared on her screen. The ride request came from a dimly lit residential area on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. Dashcam footage from Spicuzza's car showed her arriving at the pickup location, where she waited briefly before a young man approached and entered the back seat. It was Calvin Crew, a 22-year-old who had created the account using someone else's information. The video shows Spicuzza making friendly conversation as she pulled away from the curb. "I'm just doing this until Tuesday," she told him, "until my tax return comes in." She had no way of knowing the passenger behind her had already slipped a gun out of his pocket. Approximately 3 minutes into the ride, the dashcam captured the moment everything changed. Crew leaned forward and pressed the gun to the back of Spicuzza's head. "Keep driving," he ordered. Her face, visible in the footage, transformed from casual friendliness to shock and terror. "I have a family," Spicuzza pleaded, her voice trembling. "I'm begging you." Crew remained silent, keeping the gun pressed against her skull as he directed her to drive toward a secluded area. At one point, Spicuzza reached back and felt the gun. "I have 4 kids," she said. The dashcam footage ended abruptly when Crew noticed it and removed it from the windshield. What happened next was pieced together by investigators from GPS data and forensic evidence. Crew forced Spicuzza to drive to a wooded area in Monroeville, approximately 15 minutes from the pickup location. There, he shot her once in the back of the head at close range. The bullet severed her brainstem, causing instant death. Her body was left face down in the snow among the trees, where it remained undiscovered for days while her family searched frantically. Her car was found abandoned miles away, with Crew's fingerprints on the dashcam he had discarded. UFC fighter Rodrigo de Lima. On April 21, 2019, Rodrigo de Lima left a party with friends in Belém, Brazil. The 26-year-old former UFC fighter was known for his submissions in the octagon, where he had earned the nickname Monstro. That night, he called an Uber to take him and his friends home. The driver who arrived was Jefferson Roger Messiel Barada, a 37-year-old who had been working for Uber for less than 6 months. The ride began normally, but tension quickly developed inside the car. According to witnesses, de Lima and his friends became concerned about Barada's driving, which they perceived as erratic and dangerous. An argument erupted. De Lima, sitting in the front passenger seat, confronted Barada about his speed and handling of the vehicle. The verbal exchange escalated, with both men raising their voices. When Barada refused to slow down, de Lima demanded he stop the car immediately. Uber pulled to the curb in the Avenida João Paulo II area, a busy thoroughfare even at that late hour. De Lima and his friends exited the vehicle, the argument continuing on the roadside. Witnesses reported seeing de Lima bang his hand on the hood of the car while shouting at Barada. The fighter then turned to walk away with his friends. friends. Barada drove off, appearing to leave the scene. Security camera footage from a nearby business showed the Uber traveling about 100 meters down the road before making a sudden U-turn. The car accelerated rapidly, headlights gleaming against the dark pavement as it sped back toward the group. Delima's friends noticed the approaching vehicle first. They shouted warnings, but Delima had his back turned. The Uber struck him from behind at high speed, the impact launching his body several meters through the air. A 185-pound fighter's body hit the pavement with devastating force, causing massive internal trauma. Bystanders rushed to help, but Delima's injuries were catastrophic. The impact had ruptured multiple organs and caused severe cranial trauma. He died on the scene, blood pooling beneath him on the pavement as his friends watched in horror, unable to help the man who had survived professional fights against some of the world's most dangerous opponents. Sophia Liu. On December 31st, 2013, what should have been a night of celebration turned into tragedy on the streets of San Francisco. 6-year-old Sophia was crossing Polk Street with her mother Juan Kwang and 5-year-old brother Anthony, heading home after a family dinner. They were in a marked crosswalk, following all the rules that children are taught will keep them safe. Behind the wheel of a Honda SUV was Syed Muzaffar, a driver who had been working with Uber for just 1 month. He was logged into the Uber app, waiting for his next fare. His attention was split between the road and his phone as he made a right turn onto Polk Street around 8 p.m. Witnesses later said Muzaffar failed to yield to the pedestrians who had the right of way. The SUV accelerated into the turn, the driver not seeing the family until it was too late. The impact was immediate. Sophia was struck first, the force of the collision throwing her small body several feet across the pavement. The initial trauma was catastrophic. Sophia suffered severe head injuries and multiple fractures throughout her body. She was still conscious as she lay on the cold pavement. Her mother, despite being seriously injured herself with a fractured skull, crawled toward her daughter. Juan later described hearing Sophia's labored breathing, seeing her child's eyes open but growing distant. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but Sophia's injuries were too severe. Blood pooled beneath her as paramedics worked frantically to stabilize her. Her small chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty as her body fought against the trauma. Her mother watched helplessly, her own injuries preventing her from reaching her daughter. Sophia died at the scene, her last moments spent on cold pavement as New Year's Eve celebrations continued around them. Her death highlighted a critical gap in rideshare regulations. Uber initially denied responsibility, claiming Muzaffar wasn't providing services on their platform at the moment of impact. The company that connected drivers to passengers had failed to connect responsibility to safety. Sylvester Zottola. On October 4th, 2018, Sylvester Zottola pulled his SUV into a McDonald's drive-thru in the Bronx. The 71-year-old real estate businessman was known for his tough approach to business and connections to organized crime families in New York. As he waited for his order in the vehicle, he had no idea he was being tracked by a GPS device planted on his car weeks earlier. Zottola had survived multiple attempts on his life in the previous year. In November 2017, he was stabbed in the neck and chest outside his home. In December, 3 men invaded his house, stabbed him, and cut his throat. Somehow, he survived both attacks. But this time would be different. As Zottola's SUV idled in the narrow drive-thru lane, a dark sedan pulled up alongside him, the driver's window lowered. Within seconds, 5 gunshots were fired at point-blank range. The bullets tore through the side window of Zottola's vehicle, striking him in the head, chest, and shoulder. The shots were precise and clearly intended to guarantee death. There was no chance of survival. As blood spread across the interior of the SUV, Zottola slumped over the steering wheel. His foot slipped off the brake, causing his vehicle to roll forward slowly before stopping against the restaurant wall. First responders found him still strapped in his seatbelt, the engine running, food order undelivered. He was pronounced dead at the scene. What investigators discovered in the following months was more disturbing than the execution-style killing itself. The hit had been orchestrated by Anthony Zottola Sr., Sylvester's own son. Anthony had paid Bashan Shelton, a member of the Bloods gang, $200,000 to have his father killed. The GPS tracker was the key to finding Sylvester at the drive-thru that day, where he had become a sitting target with no escape route. The father's death allowed the son to take control of the family's multi-million-dollar real estate empire, turning a simple drive-thru visit into a calculated assassination. Anthony Makowski. On April 24, 2005, a warm spring night in Jacksonville, Florida, Anthony Makowski pulled into a McDonald's parking lot with friends. The 21-year-old Navy man had spent the evening at a nightclub and stopped for late-night food. What began as a routine fast food run would end in his death, captured entirely on the restaurant's security cameras. Around 2:15 a.m., Makowski and his friends were waiting in the drive-thru lane when they became involved in a verbal altercation with another group of young men. The argument quickly escalated. Security footage showed Makowski exiting his vehicle and confronting the other group in the parking lot. Words were exchanged, tensions rose, and within moments the confrontation turned physical. Makowski was grabbed by 20-year-old Lacey Eberly, who applied what witnesses later described as a chokehold or headlock from behind. The security camera captured Mikowski's initial struggle as Eberly maintained his grip. For approximately 90 seconds, Eberly held Mikowski in the restraint. The medical examiner would later determine this caused a fatal interruption of blood flow to Mikowski's brain. In those critical seconds, oxygen deprivation began causing irreversible damage. Witnesses reported seeing Mikowski's face turning purple, his legs kicking less and less as the seconds passed. By the time Eberly released his hold, Mikowski collapsed to the pavement, unresponsive. Bystanders attempted CPR, but the damage was already done. Paramedics arrived within minutes, finding Mikowski without pulse or respiration. He was transported to Shands Jacksonville Medical Center, where he was pronounced dead. The autopsy revealed Mikowski had died from asphyxiation due to compression of his neck blood vessels. Despite the clear video evidence of the incident, prosecutors declined to file criminal charges, ruling that Eberly had acted in self-defense. This decision sparked outrage and eventually led to a civil lawsuit from Mikowski's family, challenging how a fast food argument had turned into a death sentence. Anthony Tony Isles. On September 8, 2021, Anthony Isles pulled his vehicle into a McDonald's drive-thru in Vancouver, British Columbia. The 42-year-old elevator mechanic was making a routine stop for breakfast before heading to work. He had just celebrated his wedding anniversary days before, and photos on social media showed a happy family man with his wife and 2 young children, ages 8 and 6. As Isles reached the payment window, he handed over his bank card to pay for his meal. The transaction complete, the employee returned his card, but instead of landing in Isles' hand, it fell to the ground outside his vehicle. It was a small mistake that would have fatal consequences. Isles put his car in park but left the engine running as he opened his door to retrieve the card. What happened next was captured on the restaurant's surveillance cameras. As Isles leaned out to reach for his card, his vehicle suddenly moved forward. The gap between his SUV and the building's brick wall rapidly closed. In a split second, Isles became pinned between his car door and the restaurant's structure. The pressure immediately crushed his chest and abdomen, restricting his ability to breathe. Drive-thru staff heard his initial cry for help and rushed outside, but found themselves unable to move the vehicle or free him from the deadly compression. For several agonizing minutes, Isles remained conscious, trapped in the narrowing space as his vital organs were compressed. Oxygen deprivation began affecting his brain as he struggled for breath against the immovable wall and weight of his own vehicle. By the time emergency responders arrived and managed to move the vehicle, the damage was catastrophic. Despite immediate medical attention, Anthony Isles was pronounced dead at the scene from a traumatic asphyxiation and internal injuries. The Vancouver Police Department later determined that he had likely bumped the gear shift while reaching down, causing the vehicle to lurch forward while he was partially outside it. What should have been a mundane breakfast stop had turned deadly in mere seconds over a dropped bank card. Richard Lowry. On October 17, 2022, Richard Lowry celebrated his 86th birthday with family in Olathe, Kansas. After the gathering, the elderly man decided to treat himself to a meal at a local McDonald's drive-thru. It was a cool autumn evening when Lowry pulled his silver Honda sedan into the narrow lane of the restaurant. Friends would later describe him as an active senior who still enjoyed his independence despite his advanced age. As Lowry reached the payment window and prepared to order, he accidentally dropped his eyeglasses from the vehicle. The prescription glasses fell just outside his car door, close enough that he thought he could retrieve them without leaving his vehicle. Security camera footage later showed Lowry opening his door and leaning out while still seated behind the wheel. What he didn't realize was that his foot was slipping off the brake pedal. In a tragic sequence captured by the restaurant's surveillance system, Lowry's body stretched further out of the vehicle as he reached for the glasses. His foot then made contact with the accelerator pedal. The Honda lurched forward suddenly and with significant force. The open car door struck the building's exterior wall, creating an instant crush point with Lowry caught in between. The impact pinned Lowry's head and upper body between the door and the wall. Witnesses reported hearing a sickening sound as his skull made contact with the brick exterior. Drive-thru employees rushed outside but found Lowry already unconscious, with severe trauma visible to his head and neck. The pressure had caused immediate and catastrophic damage to his brainstem. First responders arrived within minutes and managed to free him from the compression point, but the injury had already proven fatal. Despite resuscitation attempts, Richard Lowry was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later confirmed that blunt force trauma to the head was the cause of death. The date on his death certificate would match that of his birth certificate, a cruel coincidence that turned a birthday celebration into his final day. Kendrick Engram Jr. On June 26, 2022, temperatures in Columbus, Georgia reached a sweltering 96 degrees Fahrenheit. 3-year-old Kendrick Engram Jr. spent the day with his grandmother and other family members, visiting church and running various errands. The little boy, known for his bright smile and energetic personality, had no way of knowing that this ordinary Sunday would be his last. After a day of activities, the family stopped at a Wendy's drive-thru around 5:30 p.m. Kendrick's grandmother was driving the SUV with several other children inside. After ordering food, they returned home, where the grandmother and other children exited the vehicle. In the confusion of managing multiple young children, a critical oversight occurred. Kendrick remained buckled in his car seat in the third row of the SUV, forgotten and left behind. For the next 2 hours and 45 minutes, the temperature inside the vehicle climbed rapidly. Scientific studies show that on a 96-degree day, the interior of a parked car can reach 124 degrees in just 30 minutes. After 1 hour, temperatures can exceed 140 degrees. Kendrick was trapped in these escalating conditions, unable to free himself from his car seat. The physiological effects would have been swift and severe. Medical experts describe how a child's body temperature rises 3 to 5 times faster than an adult's. As the heat intensified, Kendrick would have experienced increasing distress. His breathing would have become labored as his body attempted to cool itself. Dehydration would have set in rapidly, causing his heart to beat faster while his organs began to shut down. Around 8:15 p.m., Kendrick's uncle borrowed the SUV to make a food run, returning to the same Wendy's drive-thru. While waiting in line, he discovered the child's motionless body still strapped in the back seat. He immediately drove to the emergency room, but it was too late. Hospital staff pronounced Kendrick dead from hyperthermia. His small body had simply been unable to withstand the extreme heat. Inside the closed vehicle, with no water and no means of escape, the toddler had suffered a slow, agonizing death while his family remained unaware just yards away. Charles Wood Jr. On December 20th, 2018, a cold winter night in St. Louis, Charles Wood Jr. pulled his car into a Jack-in-the-Box drive-thru. The 20-year-old was a former high school football player who worked at a local factory. Friends described him as outgoing and quick to smile. It was around 10 p.m. when he placed his order at the speaker box, then drove forward to the payment window. When Wood reached the pickup window, the employee handed him his food order. But there was a problem. The bag was just out of his reach. Rather than opening his door and stepping out, Wood chose to remain seated while extending his upper body out of the driver's side window. Security camera footage would later show him stretching his arm toward the bag, fingers outstretched, as the employee tried to close the gap. What happened next occurred in mere seconds. As Wood leaned further out, his foot apparently slipped off the brake pedal. The car was still in drive with engine running. Witnesses reported seeing the vehicle suddenly lurch backward in an arc. Before Wood could pull himself back inside, his car slammed into a tree situated near the drive-thru lane. The impact caught him between the driver's door and the tree trunk. The force of the collision immediately compressed Wood's torso, head, neck, and legs. Bystanders rushed to help, but the position of the vehicle made it nearly impossible to free him quickly. Wood was conscious for the first moments after impact, gasping for breath as the pressure on his chest increased. Employees and customers tried desperately to move the car, but without equipment, they could not generate enough force. Emergency responders arrived within 6 minutes, but found Wood unresponsive at the scene. Despite their efforts to extract him and begin life-saving measures, the damage was too severe. The medical examiner would later determine that Wood died from traumatic asphyxia and extensive internal injuries. The compression had collapsed his ribcage, restricting his ability to breathe while causing catastrophic damage to his internal organs. A simple food order had turned fatal in less than 10 seconds because of a momentary lapse in judgment and a vehicle that was never put in park. The Eight Immortals restaurant incident. In August 1985, the quiet streets of Macau became the setting for one of the most brutal restaurant massacres ever recorded. Huang Jiheng was a 29-year-old gambler, known in local circles for his mounting debts and increasingly desperate behavior. The Wang family owned and operated the Eight Immortals restaurant, a popular establishment where locals gathered for traditional Cantonese cuisine. They had made the mistake of lending Huang 600,000 patakas, approximately $75,000 in today's currency. On August 4th, Huang entered the restaurant after closing time. Security footage later showed him arriving at 11:47 p.m. carrying a bag containing knives and rope. The Huang family was finishing their end-of-day routine when Huang confronted them about the debt. Within minutes, the confrontation escalated. Huang methodically killed each family member, starting with the patriarch, 62-year-old Wang Hong. Some were stabbed with kitchen knives found on the premises. Others were strangled with electrical cords. Medical examiners later determined that several victims remained conscious during the initial attacks, aware of family members being murdered nearby. After killing all 10 family members, including 2 children aged 4 and 6, Huang began the process of dismemberment. Using butcher tools from the restaurant kitchen, he separated limbs from torsos, working through the night. He packed body parts into plastic bags and restaurant food containers. Between 3:30 a.m. and 5:15 a.m., Huang made multiple trips to dispose of the remains. Some were thrown into the ocean off Macau's eastern shore. Others were placed in dumpsters throughout the city. Police discovered the first remains on August 6th when a restaurant customer reported the establishment mysteriously closed. Huang was arrested 3 days later while attempting to flee to mainland China. Popeye's shooting incident. On April 16, 1994, the Popeye's restaurant in Gadsden, Alabama was preparing to close for the night. 4 employees were completing their final tasks inside the fast food establishment. At 10:47 p.m., Robert Bryant Melson and Kahuatamak Hinriki Parida entered through the unlocked front door. Melson, 23, carried a .45 caliber handgun. Parida, 17, served as lookout. The employees immediately recognized the danger. Bryant Bailey, 23, tried to reason with the intruders. His co-workers, Nathaniel Baker, 17, Tamika Collins, 18, and Daryl Collier, 23, stood frozen behind the counter. Melson ordered all 4 to move toward the walk-in freezer at the back of the restaurant. Security footage later showed the employees complying, their hands raised. At 10:52 p.m., all 4 were forced inside the 8x10-foot freezer. Witnesses in a nearby parking lot reported hearing multiple gunshots in rapid succession. Inside the freezer, Melson fired 7 shots at close range. Bryant Bailey was hit in the neck and chest. Nathaniel Baker received bullets to his head and torso. Tamika Collins was shot 3 times in the chest. Each died within seconds from catastrophic blood loss and organ damage. Daryl Collier was shot in the face, but the bullet followed an unusual path, exiting without hitting vital structures. He collapsed among his dead co-workers, bleeding profusely but conscious. The robbers took $2,100 from the register and fled. For 15 minutes, Collier lay among the bodies in the freezing cold, fighting shock and blood loss. When police arrived at 11:23 p.m., they found him still alive. Melson was executed by lethal injection on June 8, 2017. Parida remains on death row after murdering a fellow inmate in 1999. A fatal gust of wind incident. On January 19, 2023, Lillian and Lloyd Curtis were driving through Elizabethtown, Kentucky. The couple, married for 58 years, were returning from a doctor's appointment. Lloyd, 77, was behind the wheel of their silver Honda sedan. Lillian, 72, sat in the passenger seat. At 1:48 p.m., they pulled into the parking lot of a Denny's restaurant on Mulberry Street. The day was unusually windy, with gusts reaching 70 miles per hour. Meteorologists later called it one of the strongest wind events in the region that year. As the Curtis vehicle parked in a space directly beneath the restaurant's sign, a powerful gust struck the area. The Denny's sign, a 1.3-ton metal and plastic structure mounted on a 20-foot pole, had passed its most recent inspection just 3 months earlier. Engineers would later determine that the sign's mounting bolts had been properly installed. The wind itself was the only factor. At 1:50 p.m., security cameras captured the moment the sign broke free from its mounting. It took less than 2 seconds to fall. The sign crashed directly onto the Honda's passenger side, crushing the roof down to the seat level. Lillian Curtis suffered an immediate catastrophic head injury. First responders arrived within 4 minutes, but found her without pulse or respiration. Lloyd Curtis was conscious when paramedics reached him. The impact had caused severe internal injuries and crushing trauma to his lower body. He was trapped in the vehicle for 37 minutes while rescue workers cut through the wreckage. At the University of Louisville Hospital, doctors determined he had suffered multiple organ failures. Despite 3 surgeries over the next 4 days, Lloyd Curtis's condition deteriorated. On January 23rd at 3:15 p.m., he died from complications of his injuries. Mistaken for homeless, left to die incident. On August 3, 2025, Jesse Mobley Jr. entered the Capitol Steakhouse in downtown Houston, Texas. The 34-year-old construction worker had just finished his shift and was meeting friends for dinner. At 7:42 p.m., security cameras captured Mobley suddenly clutching his chest while standing near the bar. He collapsed onto the floor seconds later. Other diners immediately moved away, unsure what was happening. Restaurant staff approached Mobley as he lay on the polished marble floor. The manager, 41-year-old Thomas Weller, checked for signs of intoxication but made no attempt to assess Mobley's medical condition. At 7:45 p.m., Weller instructed 2 servers to remove Mobley from the premises. Security footage showed the servers dragging Mobley by his arms across the restaurant floor. Mobley was conscious during this time, attempting to speak and clearly in distress. His medical emergency was later determined to be a severe cardiac arrhythmia, a treatable condition if medical help had been summoned. Instead of calling 911, the restaurant staff carried Mobley to a service exit at the rear of the building. At 7:51 p.m., they placed him on the ground next to garbage dumpsters in an unlit alley. The temperature that evening was 94 degrees. For 28 minutes, Mobley remained in the alley, occasionally moving his arms and trying to call for help. No staff member checked on his condition. A delivery driver discovered Mobley at 8:19 p.m. and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived at 8:26 p.m. and found Mobley without a pulse. Despite resuscitation attempts, he was pronounced dead at 8:47 p.m. Autopsy results confirmed that immediate medical intervention could have saved his life. The surveillance footage, obtained by local news stations 4 days later, showed staff members laughing as they returned from the alley. Tina's Burritos Factory incident. On July 12, 2025, Maria Delgado arrived for her night shift at Tina's Burritos factory in Vernon, California. The 19-year-old had been working at the industrial food processing plant for just 6 months. Her responsibilities included cleaning the massive food processors after production ended. At 11:30 p.m., the main production line shut down. Workers began their cleaning protocols, a process that normally took 2 hours. The primary food processor was an Italian-made Gastromac industrial mixer, standing 7 feet tall with a mixing capacity of 500 pounds. Company protocol required the machine to be fully powered down and locked out before cleaning. Security camera footage later revealed that at 11:47 p.m., Maria entered the cleaning area alone. For unknown reasons, the machine had not been properly shut down. The electronic lockout tag, designed to prevent accidental activation, was missing from the control panel. At 11:52 p.m., Maria climbed onto a stepladder to reach inside the upper chamber of the processor. She was using a scraper to remove dried food residue from the mixing blades. 3 minutes later, another worker in a different part of the facility accidentally activated the machine's remote start function. The mixer's industrial-grade motor engaged immediately. The stainless steel mixing blades began rotating at 120 RPM. Maria had no time to react. Her right arm was caught between the blades, pulling her entire body into the machine. Workers nearby heard her screams and rushed to the area. By the time they reached the emergency shutoff button, 27 seconds had passed. When emergency services arrived at 12:14 a.m., they found Maria's body completely entangled in the machinery. Medical examiners later determined she remained conscious for approximately 15 seconds after initial entrapment. Death occurred from massive trauma and blood loss. Investigators discovered that the machine's safety interlock had been deliberately disabled 6 weeks earlier to increase production speed. Palermo's Pizza Factory incident. On September 17, 2025, Robert Chiron reported for his regular shift at Palermo's pizza manufacturing facility in West Milwaukee. The 45-year-old maintenance technician had worked at the factory for 8 years. His job involved ensuring the automated production line ran smoothly. At 10:15 a.m., Chiron responded to a minor stoppage in the dough forming section. The robotic arm responsible for stretching pizza dough had detected an irregularity and automatically paused. This particular machine was a KR420 industrial robot manufactured by KUKA Robotics. It stood 12 feet tall with a reach of 9 feet and could exert 2.5 tons of pressure at maximum extension. Company protocol required all technicians to remain outside the safety cage while the robot was in diagnostic mode. Security footage showed Chiron entering the cage at 10:17 a.m. He carried standard diagnostic tools and approached the base of the robot. What happened next was captured by multiple cameras. At 10:19 a.m., Chiron leaned forward to check a sensor on the robot's main hydraulic line. The machine, still in diagnostic mode, suddenly reactivated. Its massive arm swung in an unexpected pattern, pinning Chiron against the metal frame of the dough-forming table. The force was immediate and catastrophic. The 2,200-pound arm crushed Chiron's torso between two metal surfaces. Workers on the production floor heard the impact and his initial cries for help. 3 employees rushed to the emergency stop button, but the damage was already done. Medical examiners later determined that Chiron suffered complete crushing of his chest cavity. Major blood vessels to his heart were severed instantly. He remained conscious for approximately 30 seconds, unable to breathe as his lungs were compressed. When emergency services arrived at 10:28 a.m., Chiron was already deceased. And investigators discovered that a software update installed the previous night had created a critical error in the robot's safety protocols. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.